Yeah.
And now it's time. So I want to wish you a warm welcome to this seminar where we will discuss the not so minor topic of the institutional future of the European Union. Just recently, we've seen a global pandemic. We are seeing a Russian invasion of a free democratic European country. And before that, we had the Brexit vote. And in addition to that, we got something of a global contest of some subsidizing industries. We've got social and environmental changes, etc., etc. And we have a 30-year-old inner European Union market. So one might say that that's one or several turning points for the European Union, but towards what? An ever closer union or something else? That is what we will discuss today. So let me once again wish you all welcome to this webinar. This is organized by the Ratio Institute. That is an independent research institute based in Sweden. And my name is Johanna Grönbeck. I'm the head of communications at the Ratio Institute, and I will be the one moderating this seminar. So the main event of this seminar are the three researchers who will all share their takes one by one, and then we will have a joint discussion between them, and then we will have an open Q&A with you in the audience. So please feel free to write your questions as we go along with the seminar. And let me just also say that this seminar is recorded and will later on be published on YouTube. So now it's time for the fun to begin. We will listen to Professor Dr. Michel Wohlgemuth from the Foundation for Economic Governance and Public Law in Liechtenstein. We will listen to Professor Nils Karlson from the Ratio Institute in Sweden, and Dr. Dalibor Rohac, who is Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in the United States. So with that said, the floor is yours, Professor Dr. Michel Wohlgemuth.
Thank you very much, Johanna. It's a pleasure to see you all. I don't see the audience, the invisible audience, but still I try to, I'm not sure if it's going to be funny, but we'll see. I'm sharing my screen. Don't be afraid, it's only some 6 or so. This is what I'm talking about in 10 minutes, the political union and the legitimacy challenge. And I would first like to make a distinction that there are 2 levels of democracy deficits or legitimacy deficits. The one is the domestic on the level of the member states, and the other is with European institutions. And, you know, just like charity starts at home, I think also democracy starts at home, and lots of the legitimacy democracy deficits can be identified on a national level. And certainly if the governments of European Union member states give up sovereignty to the European Union without asking the sovereign, and the sovereign is the citizens, and also if the members of the national executive in Brussels, in the council, make laws that take precedence even over national constitutions, because European law trumps national law, without very often really engaging their own parliaments at home, then we have, from a constitutional economics point of view, a very difficult situation, because the, say, constitutional contract, the contrat social between the principles of the citizens and their agents, the governments, would then be unilaterally changed by members of the executive that sign European law into law and European constitutions and contracts. And on the level of European institutions, the EU level legitimacy challenges can be divided also into several parts. There's this beautiful German word, competence. Who has the competence to claim competence to do things. And in some instances, we can see that some of this competence to decide on the allocation of competencies is given to or is unilaterally assumed by, say, the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, or the European Parliament. And if in addition then more elementary decisions are taken by a majority vote, this might increase the effectiveness or the sheer amount of political output of European Union decision making, but very much at the expense of a reduced input legitimacy. And that is what I was talking about, this constitutional contract that political decisions have to have some backing from the people who sent their representatives to Brussels. And Fritz Schaap, who is the originator of this concept of input and output legitimacy, says under such conditions, no single government could be held politically accountable for the ultimate outcome. And this is what we observe, and this is perhaps also part of this ingrained Euroscepticism that we can observe, that these things are no longer under democratic control, people would claim. And if these people then are also expected to obey laws that they or their representatives have not authored, have not given consent to, then legitimacy is in crisis. The other point that I wanted to shortly address is that, democracy is more than just electing a parliament, including a European Parliament. What is needed for European democracy are some mediatory structures that would allow communication between citizens and politicians in order to translate the interests, values, and ideas of those citizens into political programs. And this intermediate structure of political communication, I think, is deeply distorted by the elite discourse that dominates in Brussels. We have some quite natural organizational impediments to this political communication. The policy issues in Brussels are often not visible to the public and also to domestic parliaments before the decisions are taken. So very often we are simply, after a long night in the morning, we get some results of what our presidents or heads of state have decided. And political deliberation often starts only at the very end of long, very technocratic drafting processes, or even after the fact, after the law is already the law that trumps national law. And the other point is that European politics very often has to do without a corresponding European public sphere. There's no European public opinion or public arena that would accommodate these decisions. We have no European party system, we have no European media, we have no common language, and all that creates a situation where one could claim that there's democracy without a demos. We have lots of kratos, but no demos, and this is an awkward situation. And the following speaker, Nils Karlson, will perhaps try to find a way out of this legitimacy trap. And I think we might agree how to decrease these legitimacy problems. My model would be very close to that of Larry Siedentop, to see the EU as an association of sovereign states which pool their sovereignty in very restricted areas and to varying degrees. There's this kind of flexibility or Europe of variable geometry or as Niels perhaps would put it, pluralistic federalism would be a way to make these legitimacy problems less urgent, because we could see a voluntary cooperation in various policy fields according to the consent of citizens and the national parliaments. And the EU and Brussels and all these institutions would still be there. You know, I don't want to abolish the EU, especially because it has very great achievements such as the single market and free movement and all that. But the EU would have a role less of an agenda setter on its own right, but as a broker and, if asked, then also third-party enforcer of these arrangements that would allow different countries to cooperate in different fields as they or their citizens wish. And with that, I think my 10 minutes are over, and I hand over to Niels. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. And Nils, please.
Can you see this? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yep.
Very well. So I have quite a few slides actually. And I very much agree with Michelle here that the EU is really at a crossroads. We need a more fundamental discussion about how we should organize the EU in the future. So I'm very happy for this seminar, Johanna. And we should recognize that the EU is a success in many ways, you know. They have secured freedom, peace, democracy, and prosperity in Europe for a long time now, and created this fantastic internal market with 500 million people. It's a unique thing that's been achieved. But it's also a union that has fundamental challenges. And I think this quote says quite a bit about the challenges of federalist systems. The problem which all federalist nations have to solve is to keep the centrifugal and centripetal forces in equilibrium, so that neither the planet states shall fly off into the space, nor the sun of central government draw them into its consuming fires. And I think there's a real risk here that the consuming fires will take over the nation states here. So if we look back on the history of the EU, one can look at two different visions of where the EU should be. So there's a centralistic vision and there's a pluralistic vision. And the centralistic vision is what we have basically. It's no really limit to centralizations, a very pragmatic view, as Michelle was saying, about the competences. They decide themselves what should be handled by the member states and by the EU itself. But we also have another vision, more pluralistic, more federalistic in the sense that there's a clear division of powers here. I will return to this. So the second version is like diversity in unity. We approve of unity, but also diversity. So in the famous, foundation of the EU, the Schuman Declaration from 1950, we can very much see this centralized vision of, well, started with coal and steel, but the ambition was really also to equalize living conditions, everything from above. So I won't read this full quote, but you can do it if you want to. Securing the shortest possible time of modernization, production, and so on and so forth. So the idea here was this functionalist idea that we have these economic political independencies, we create this free mobility from the beginning, that leads to economic integration, preferences will become similar, we will have political integration, and we will have more independence, and it will be this positive virtuous circle. And this has actually happened in many areas. We should acknowledge this. However, we all can't agree. The EU has moved in a direction where they move forward in certain areas, but within the EU system. So it's the euro, it's the PESCO, well, that's defense collaboration. It's the AFSJ, that's more the rule of law and security issues and so on. And as you see, it's starting to become quite complicated, the Schengen agreements and so on. So in certain areas, we have enhanced cooperation, but not everyone is part of it. For example, Sweden is not part of the euro, as you all know. So in the end, the EU have started to move in various areas, creating its own competences, and it's a risk here of a creeping centralization, intended by some people, but I think basically unintended by most involved actors, not the least the voters, as Michael was indicating here, but also national governments, I don't think really understand what's going on here. So the euro, of course, implies a common monetary system, implies a common financial system. A common financial system implies a common social system. So we get the social pillar, we get demands for equal, well, rights of different kinds, a creeping way increasing the role of the EU, pushed by the parliament, pushed by the commission, and in the end, often approved by majority voting within the council. And now we have this increasing tendency with the industrial strategies, strategic autonomy, and so on. They create all these fancy new concepts all the time, and we get this process. So even though some people try to argue this is a problem, you tend to get what I would call a vicious circle of integration that doesn't promote harmonization, doesn't promote more cooperation, and so on. So if member states lose autonomy, legitimacy, and so on, the EU will lose legitimacy. You get this, rise of nationalists, populists. Everyone is blaming everyone else on all the problems we have. You get different preferences, and in the end, integration won't develop anymore. And I think we're very close to this within the EU at the moment. So people say that subsidiarity will help this, but I've written a bit about subsidiarity, and it's supposed to be decentralizing. But as you know, many areas there are, double, or the EU doesn't have exclusive competence, but it's a shared competence between the member states and the EU. And if the EU can argue, as they do, certain things, for example, budget disciplines or well, minimum wages, whatever, aren't achieved sufficiently at the member level, or it can be more effectively achieved at the EU level, then, in fact, subsidiarity leads to centralization. This is very, very problematic. Recommendations and so on turns into directives and a real centralizing force. So my two last slides, I'm going to try to explain what I think is the alternative here. I call this pluralistic federalism. One can use different terms. So it's a guaranteed division of power between central and local bodies. You have a federal level, and you have member states which have unique competences, unique decision-making rights. And you should have a clear division here, And this needs also a constitutional development where you have real bicameralism, a rigid constitution, and a strong judicial review that is not supposed to promote an ever closer union. So this is what diversity and unity is all about. And such a system has certain advantages. Promotes diversity, preference satisfaction, participation. You have a public here, accountability, and also this increased division of power. But also, I would say, a more dynamic view of efficiency through institutional competition and learning. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't centralize certain things, and perhaps some things that today aren't centralized, like military cooperation and so on, should be lifted up to the EU level. So my last slide is this. My idea is to have a 4-level federal system in Europe. You have the federal level with really common collective issues. Then you have enhanced cooperation, like the euro, but also other things that are actually not part of the EU. It's voluntary. So you can exit from those systems. Then you have other kinds of voluntary cooperation with outside the EU completely, and also, of course, the member state level. So that's my idea where we should move the EU in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nils. I want to remind all of you who are participants that you are allowed and encouraged to write your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So thank you, Nils. And Dalibor Rohac, please.
Johanna, thank you. And it's great to be with all of you. Obviously, Michael and Nils and I have a common history and overlapping interests. So I'll be echoing some of the themes that have been raised by both of them. I should also apologize that I'm doing this on the cheap with no slides, so you'll be just looking at my face and awkward gesturing. I suppose what really is at the heart of this conversation is the ambiguity in the European project that goes back to its inception about what the EU and the European project is about. Is it a federal state in the making, or even a unitary state in the making, or is it simply an association of nation states that have decided to work together in certain areas? And obviously the EU can be sort of seen through both of these sets of lenses. It can be seen as a project in the making, a sort of forward moving vehicle that is meant to produce something qualitatively different than a Europe governed predominantly by nation states, or again can be seen as just an order that sort of constrains member states in various ways and provides for certain European level public goods and so on and so forth. And throughout the EU's history, the balance has been tilted very heavily in that former direction, in the direction of the idea that we are moving towards something, so towards some kind of shared endpoint, which is why, by the way, even when the European project has clearly lacked attributes of either procedural legitimacy or even output legitimacy, its most vocal self-styled federalist proponents have been arguing that there is always this reward at the end of the road, which sort of justifies the sacrifices that we have to make and justifies all these decisions that need to be made. And I think this tension explains why very often European discussions are moving between two extremes. Either there is what the Italian political scientist Gian Domenico Maggione called a political culture of boundless optimism, where we sort of, have these sort of outbursts of energy where we decide to do things together, and we are sort of claiming to be in a different era, like, at many points during this war in Ukraine, this appeals to European unity and common, procurement on defense, sanctions, etc., have supposedly provided a proof of a, qualitatively new Europe that has emerged. Or alternatively, just a couple of years ago, we've been facing existential crises, sort of dreading that the whole project will unravel, will collapse. The idea that, the UK would trigger a series of exits from the EU, the idea that the refugee crisis would unravel the EU, that the common currency would collapse, and so on and so forth. And I think it would be helpful for Europeans to move beyond this dichotomy and actually to sort of rebalance the project towards its understanding as a vehicle for managing diversity. I mean, the basic fact about the European continent is that it is very hard to centralize it politically. Since the end of the Roman Empire has never happened. My colleague at the AEI, Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, who also teaches at Penn, has a wonderful paper with Mark Koyama and co-authors that actually look at European geography as a major factor in preventing political centralization. So they do these simulations where they look at China and Europe, and they run numerous sort of simulations of political processes happening in both places, and by virtue of the way European landmass is structured, it's very difficult to sort of arrive at a continental Europe that's politically centralized under very sort of reasonable assumptions. And we and economic historians sort of understand that diversity that has always existed there on the European continent has been a major factor in Europe's success in the emergence of the Enlightenment, in keeping rulers to account. Edward Gibbon talks about it already when he says that the division of Europe into a number of independent states is productive of the most beneficial consequences to the liberty of mankind. He compares that with the Roman Empire, which basically became a dreary prison for everybody involved because there was no political alternative to it. And so there is, I think, a sort of real urgency around sort of rebalancing the EU in this direction of making it more amenable to managing diversity and pluralism and disagreement, as opposed to coming up with one-size-fits-all solutions as the default. And that urgency stems from the fact that although the EU does lack, as both Nils and Michael alluded to, lacks an explicit sort of legal or constitutional limiting principle to the growth of its competencies and power, there is a very strong realpolitik, if you will, limiting principle to it, which is its internal diversity. I mean, the more members you have, the more different they are, the harder it is to arrive at those common solutions. And I think we've seen this mechanism at play at numerous junctures, particularly after the EU's eastern enlargements. I was born and brought up in Eastern Europe. I think enlarging the EU to the east was a wonderful thing, has done wonders for people of Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and other countries. At the same time, that increased diversity made it harder to arrive at common decisions. I mean, you look at economic performance, look at GDP of Bulgaria in per capita terms and GDP of Luxembourg. The gap has opened. We haven't seen convergence, at least not to the extent that the sort of more optimistic observers hoped for. We've seen divergence on culture matters, whether they have to do with immigration. There was a 2017 poll by European Social Surveys where 60% of Hungarians said that no migrants should be allowed to enter from poorer countries from outside of Europe, right? That's a very sort of striking and rather extreme position, which is at odds with, the views held by, say, people of Sweden or other countries. I mean, attitudes towards gay marriage, any number of issues, just pits Europeans against each other. So it strikes me that it's important to really find a sort of modus vivendi that accepts Europe as it exists, with its underlying diversity, not as we sort of imagine it to be. And obviously the answer to that, provided by classical liberals for a long time, consists of a sort of abstract idea of classical liberal federalism, where we only pool resources and do things together in areas where doing so cannot be done adequately at sort of lower levels of governance. That's sort of the traditional understanding of subsidiarity, not the sort of, the EU understanding of subsidiarity, which is, as Nils suggested, something quite different. The challenge is that we are not designing the EU from scratch, however. We have these institutions, we have the acquis communautaire, trying to overhaul it, in a classical liberal or any other direction, just runs into intractable political problems. I mean, nobody really wants to have a new set of treaties written. So I think we have to sort of, work with what we have at hand. We have to sort of agree on what the sort of, common minimum is and work around that. And what I suggest in the book, which actually, my primary purpose here is to sell my book, which is priced at very reasonable $100. It's called Governing the EU in an Age of Division. It came out in November last year with Edward Elgar. So the idea was to behind the book was to argue that you should get comfortable with the idea that the EU is not a monolith. but it's actually a number of different integration projects running in parallel, which can involve only imperfectly overlapping coalitions of countries participating in those projects, which is basically one way of sort of framing the institution of enhanced cooperation, which already exists in the EU under Article 20 of the Lisbon Treaty. And we've seen many examples over the past couple of years of sort of cooperation emerging from, in a way, bottom-up fashion, with countries sort of pooling resources and doing more stuff together on, European patent, divorce law, financial transaction tax, etc., etc. Even PESCO and defense cooperation is sort of done in a sort of intergovernmental level. So that's a way of sort of avoiding the sort of impossibility of making joint decisions at the EU level. And I think it's by and large a healthy development. I mean, the question is whether a unique reliance on enhanced cooperation and these sort of ad hoc coalitions does not erode some of the real achievements of the European project. Then I think that's an important discussion to be had. I think we have to have an agreement, Europeans have to have an agreement on what really is the sort of beating heart of Europe. And to me, it's the four freedoms, the single market. And I mean, that's why I look with, great degree of suspicion at discussions of industrial policy and relaxation of state aid rules and in a way, a sort of return to a Europe before the single market. I think this aggregation of the EU, though, would be a very sort of healthy development, particularly for the EU's foreign policy and its engagement with its neighborhood. Ukraine is obviously very keen to join the EU, but the idea of Ukraine joining as a full-fledged member, given the complicated nature of the acquis communautaire, given how long accession process has taken for previous member states, given that Ukraine's GDP per capita in real terms is less than half of that of Bulgaria, that it seems like a sort of long-term question that might actually turn many Ukrainians off their current sort of enthusiasm about the European project. So I think there is a need to sort of reinvigorate this engagement with the EU's neighborhood by offering on a case-by-case basis access to various attributes of the European project to countries that are interested. And actually, the president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, said so herself last year in the State of the Union address, where she said that Ukraine should be joining the single market as soon as possible. And I assume that what she meant was that Ukraine should join the single market, without necessarily becoming an EU member at the same time. So really blurring this line between members and non-members, it's in a way helpful. I mean, we need the UK to be as close as possible to the EU for a variety of reasons. This provides enhanced cooperation and a sort of, certain relaxation of attitudes towards, doing things together as the default and moving towards ad hoc coalitions might be a step in that direction too. And I predict, in spite of everything that is happening, and EU might run into fiscal troubles in the coming years for understandable reasons, high interest rates, etc. There'll be pressure. There's always pressure to centralize decisions and to sort of move with sort of integration in areas that are controversial. But I do expect that the EU will remain squarely intergovernmental. I mean, it is ultimately the member states who are calling the shots and who are, calling BS on the pretenses of European institutions to be the ultimate arbiters of their own powers. So on that note, I thank you, and again I commend my book Governing the EU in the State of Division to your attention.
Thank you so much, Dalibor. I've had the pleasure of looking at all three of you, and I've seen that you, during each other's presentations, you have been doing some nodding, you have been doing some non-nodding. So I guess you have reflections on what the other to have said. And Michelle, you started. Do you want to comment on what Nils and Dalibor said?
Yes, I took some notes, but actually I was perhaps nodding most because I so much agree with what my friends have said. I have a question perhaps for Nils, and in your concept, you stressed, you want to have this division of powers and combined with a strong judicial review. Have you thought about which kind of court would be, would have the competence to then decide where which competence should lie? Because we have such peculiar experience with the European Court of Justice that is really an engine for more and more centralization, and there's some self-selection processes going on that contributes to this very specific Luxembourg interpretation of subsidiarity. No judge in Luxembourg has ever used subsidiarity as a cause to intervene into centralization or stop European legislation. I think it's great for a classical liberal to ask for independent judges to take care of these public law things, but the way that things are, I'm not quite sure. There are some ideas perhaps how to establish a court, a different kind of court that would take on this judicial review.
Mm-hmm. So, should I try to answer that, Johanna? Or?
Yeah, sure. Just go ahead.
No, it's of course a very, very important question, and let me first say that I very much approve of Michael's analysis here about the democratic deficits and the legitimacy problems. And from my perspective, I think Michael's perspective as well, the way to improve legitimacy, the way to improve this, or to at least diminish this democratic deficit, is to have this more clear division of power, and that's the whole point with the bicameral system, and also with an independent court. And it's a system that needs checks and balances of various kinds here. The problem today is that all these EU institutions more or less have been given by the original treaties the same goal. And it's interesting, the saying is actually a closer union among the peoples of Europe. It's not a closer political union by itself. And my argument was basically that the current construction, where they have this goal, promotes kind of division between the peoples of Europe in a sense, unintentionally, I would say. The world is made up of do-gooders that are captured by the bad people, actually. But the do-gooders create problems. So coming back to the court, we should, of course, then revise the instruction to the court, their role. So their role should be strictly to uphold the Constitution. And the Constitution itself has to be redone, of course, and rewritten. And we tried this some 20 years ago. I was part of this process. I think Michael was also part of this discussion, and we failed, I think, So that's always a challenge. When you try to remake a constitution, they usually develop in a not so beneficial way because all these interests get in there and so on. But still, that's the way forward, I think. Or if we can increase the division of power in other ways. I would like to see, more member states exiting from some of these systems of enhanced cooperation. I'm critical towards enhanced cooperation within the EU system, basically for the reason that it's not compatible with the rule of law. I mean, it gives different laws for different member states here, and it makes the role, for example, of a court very problematic, because some of the laws apply only to some member states, and that makes it possible for countries like Hungary and Poland and others to think that we should have exceptions even in very, very fundamental areas that should be centralized. So to give one comment to Dalibor, I mean, I think we agree about the vision and the long-term orientation, but there's time for pragmatism, but there's also time for fundamental discussions. And I think it's time for fundamental discussions here.
If I may just react very quickly, because I think Nils touches on something which is a truly fundamental issue, and perhaps one of the sort of few sources of slight disagreement between us on this panel, which is this question of rule of law and common sort of legal arrangements for the EU as a whole. I mean, I agree very much that the EU can't be a free-for-all in which different groups of countries just do whatever they please without taking into consideration the sort of common shared legal framework that exists in the EU. At the same time, it strikes me that, especially over the past 20 or so years, again, the balance has been sort of tilted so heavily in the other direction, in which it's been assumed that political problems that have arisen, whether they had to do with the refugee crisis, the euro, etc., that there were legal solutions to these problems. And I think this debate about rule of law in countries like Hungary and Poland is one such example where it's been sort of assumed that whatever was happening in these countries, that we would sort of pull the trigger on some technocratic legal process that would sort of fix the problem. And what we ended up with, especially in the Polish case, is a sort of clash between two constitutional orders, if you will, where you have an ECJ ruling and a ruling by the Polish Constitutional Tribunal that basically are incompatible. This is not the first time that the EU law and EU constitutional law and national constitutional law have clashed in the past, and anybody who follows the German Federal Constitutional Court could sort of tell stories of this kind. In the past, we had mostly disagreements that were arguably happening in good faith and were sort of addressed through some sort of intergovernmental bargaining, or in the case of like ECB's monetary intervention, we've sort of left these questions unresolved, basically, and sort of try to move on. I mean, in the Polish case, you have the National Constitutional Tribunal basically defying openly European institutions, saying that they have no role in reviewing, rule of law and quality of governance in Poland. And so it is very striking. But ultimately, I mean, the question of what the EU is one that sort of keeps coming back. If the EU is an association of states, then relying on sort of legal solutions becomes tricky, because they're then always, like, all the countries will have the sort of Polish way out, and in the end, I feel that we are trapped. I mean, unless Europe really becomes the United States of Europe, or a sort of Switzerland of Europe, where there is this sort of constitutional moment that Nils makes the case for, I think we'll be always sort of trapped in a sort of in-between situation in which you just have no alternative to bargaining between EU institutions and member states. And I feel that that's in a way that's okay. I think that's a sort of Europe like we've sort of lived in for quite a long time, and I don't quite see that changing. I mean, the idea of sort of refounding Europe with a clear constitutional document that's sort of moving to some qualitatively new form of governance, I just don't see that happening.
Thank you. Michelle, I saw you doing a wave earlier. Did you want to say anything? No.
No, that's
Nils,
fine.
do you want to comment?
Sure. I think some of the, original ideas behind the European Union are still very valid, We want to promote democracy, we want to promote peace, we want to promote free markets, we want to promote prosperity. So there are core values in Europe that we all agree about. If you don't agree about those values, if you don't agree about democracy, if you don't agree about the rule of law, you shouldn't be a member. And we should be very clear about this. And of course, we have to be pragmatic to a certain extent, but there are limits. And I think this muddling through, I mean, the EU is always in a crisis, and sometimes the crisis can be, beneficial, it can make it possible to make reforms that bring things in a good direction. And maybe this, crisis with Russia attacking a free country in Europe, the Ukraine, which has actually mobilized a lot of good forces in Europe, even could have positive effects on the EU itself. So that's an optimistic take on this. I mean, I think also, the Brexit is an interesting case. I think it's clear for all observers now that it was a big mistake by the Brits to leave, and countries like Sweden really miss our friends in the UK, because we could make coalitions with a country which had a huge population, and that could, change the power balance within the Commission and the Council and the Parliament in a direction that was more free trade, more internal market, more rule of law oriented than some of the more interventionist policies that we've seen recently. So we should take lessons from that. It's a mistake to leave, but we should make our institutions, we should work to improve them. And I don't see that. I see we go in the wrong direction, a lot of time. But this is an opportunity to raise those questions. And I'm curious about Michael's solutions here. I mean, you pointed to fundamental problems, both on the national level and member state level, but also on the EU level. What should we do about it, Michael?
Perhaps it's quite similar to what I proposed in Oslo as well. This variable geometry, and you could see with Brexit as the one and only case where one country decided a little bit by accident and demagoguery to leave the European Union, and now they can see the troubles, especially also the troubles on the island of Ireland, and at the end they don't want to do many things differently. They would like to have trade deals, which they now don't have to that extent, and the great opportunities of Brexit freedom to change all the laws and regulations and stuff. There's not much there that really they would like to change, and at the same time we have these various countries that want to join the EU. So as a kind of a signal of the attractiveness of the European Union for other people, it is quite impressive. And I think no other country in the next decades would like to leave. Certainly not people in Poland, although the government in Poland is, parading as very anti-Brussels. Opinion polls show that the people in Poland, the citizens, see that as a very beneficial deal. And then you have the Ukraine and former Yugoslav countries, which will be difficult to integrate as full members in a very short time. And I think that's the key problem is also, as Dalibor mentioned, this one-size-fits-all fallacy, right? Either you are a full member of the European Union, you have to take on the full acquis communautaire, some 20,000 pages that you have to translate into not only your language, but into your law books. And I think that's not smart. You know, imagine Ukraine as a full member of the Common Agricultural Policy. They produce perhaps more grain than the rest of the EU. And how do you allocate these subsidies and stuff? And so to say that there's a core acquis communautaire, which is a win-win situation and benefits all. And that would be the single market, right? And as I described, what is the optimal club size for different policy areas? I would say when it comes to free trade, the European Union is far too small. You know, we want to have every country in the world to engage in free trade because that's a win-win thing. If it comes to a common currency, I think we too early had too many members. We should have first, you know, experimented with a few more solid economies and see how that works. And so that is not the optimum club size. When it comes to the common agricultural policy, I think the perfect size is between 0 and 1. So if French farmers want to get subsidies, they have to ask the French taxpayer and not you know, taxpayers and consumers on the whole continent. And this kind of differentiation, right, would lead not only to policies being closer to the preferences of citizens, but also perhaps to what we call institutional competition, right? There might even be outside this core acquis communautaire, which I agree would comprise the single market, the free trade stuff, and democracy and rule of law, some basic moral principles and legal principles. Beyond that, if we had more flexibility, like enhanced cooperation or the PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation in defense policies and things like that, you could easily get enough input legitimacy to reward the output legitimacy that is almost by definition already there. But I'm talking too long, and I can see there's 3 questions in the chat room. So Johanna, back to you.
Thanks. I think you sort of started to touch upon the last question that Lola Stern has written. Do countries want to join the EU because of in the market reasons or because they want EU subsidies? I don't know if anyone wants to. Yeah, sure.
Take this one as a recovering Slovak. I mean, I was still in Europe in 2004 when we joined the EU. I would argue that there is a third and different reason, which is that for Eastern Europeans at least, this was a matter of just being part of a sort of civilizational space that was different from that sort of post-Soviet chaos and misgovernance and corruption that we were sort of steeped and marinated in for close to a decade. I mean, I remember my first trip in 1989 to the neighboring villages in Austria, and I think it was a sort of shared sense of we wanted to be like them. We wanted to be part of that sort of normal Western world, and I think that's been the sort of politically salient driving force of all this. And obviously access to the single market and EU funds have been sort of means to an end, and we can talk about how effective they've been, but I think there was this sort of deeper yearning, and you see it in like when Ukrainians waved EU flags on the Maidan in 2014 in the winter. It wasn't either about the single market or about EU subsidies. It was about turning Ukraine into a European country.
That's great. I think we'll just do like You answered that question, now it's done. So let's go to the second one. Will the EU implode if the road towards unification and centralization continue based on loss of legitimacy? I don't know if it's more a Nils question or a Michelle question. Does anyone of you want to answer?
Why don't you start, Michael?
I don't think so, because if at least if rational people make the cost benefit analysis, I think most.
We have a problem, Michael, with your connection.
Or your mic or something.
Sorry, you continue.
I think maybe if I just mute and shut off your video for a second or two, and then Nils could answer the question as well, and then we'll get back to you, Michelle.
So it could either implode or it could be extremely centralized. But if it's centralized more, and I think it will be centralized more, of course, it will be able to handle some really collective, some really, challenges that Europe have. Environmental problems, for example, are problems that to a certain extent should be handled on the centralized level. But also there's the risk of, special interests coming in, and we have all these suggestions that will create border controls and so on, and diminish free trade and all this. So it's a double-edged sword. But I'm afraid that this vicious circle of integration that I presented here is a real threat to the EU. So that's what I mean. We're really in a formative moment. We have to really try to bring this discussion up to a higher level. It's not good if we start, taking further and further steps in this centralized orientation, because of what Michael explained in the beginning here. It will create problems with legitimacy. National governments will not only have, democratic problems, they will start blaming the EU for all kinds of problems as well, which is not the case. I mean, many of the problems we see in Europe exist because member states have failed, And now it's so unclear, it's so blurred where the responsibility should lie, and that's also very problematic, actually.
Thank you, Nils. And Michelle, let's do another try.
All right. I was saying, somewhat rational people would still, if they do the calculation of cost benefit of membership in the European Union, they would say, all right, the benefits still outweigh the costs, and if implosion would mean that the whole European Union collapses, and that we only have nation states that would fight each other or something. I mean that is not very likely to happen. It is more like I think Dalibor mentioned some muddling through, and the idea that Nils put forward to, let's sort things out and have another constitutional convention and treaty change in our favorable direction. I am afraid that is not going to happen, because pretty much every head of state has declared, or more or less, treaty change would be nice, but let's not open Pandora's box now. You never know what's going to happen, and it might be rejected again in Ireland or in the Netherlands or in Hungary, or even certainly in France. With populist waves now, and that's a little bit the tricky thing about direct democracy, which I think is a necessary element when it comes certainly to treaty change, because the sovereign is the people, and if then their executive changes their basic rights and even their constitution, because European law is super constitutional, then it needs to have the explicit consent based on a referendum. But at the same time, referenda are the the greatest way for populists to push their agenda and never answer the question, as perhaps even was the case with the Brexit vote. So that's a very difficult situation, and it is why I think some modeling through, some incremental reforms, and a certain direction to say, all right, if we can't have 27 member states agree on something, then let's have some 18 member states agree on something, and the others don't have to go along. As long as it doesn't touch the basic principles of the EU and including the 4 basic freedoms of movement. I think with this is a realistic view forward.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but Dalibor, you wanted to say something, so you'll get the last.
I was just aching to answer the last question from Lotta on countries that break EU rules. Should they or should they not be excluded from the EU? So I think we can all agree that we have a problem with countries like Hungary under Viktor Orban, and more broadly, there is a problem with the fact that it's very hard to get into the EU. But once you're in the EU, holding countries to account is not easy. So it's at an obvious level, breaking of rules should lead to responses, sanctions, some form of response. But where I sort of like depart from the spirit in which the question was asked is in really stressing that this is more than anything a political problem. It's not a question of sort of following the rules and breaking the rules. You could argue that Sweden committed to adopting the euro and is not going to adopt the euro anytime soon. It's not going to happen. Is it breaking the rules if it never adopts the euro? Frankly, I don't care, and I certainly don't want Sweden to be excluded from the EU just because it doesn't want to embrace the common European currency. For me, this question of excluding countries from the EU is a question of do we have bad faith, hostile actors amongst us? And I would argue that we actually do. I mean, it's enough to look at Viktor Orban's foreign policy. It's enough to look at how he sort of weaponizes Hungary's membership in the EU for domestic political aims, how he really has turned Hungary into an autocracy where I don't think political change in Hungary won't come through the ballot box anymore. And I think we are at a point where, we have to ask ourselves whether a country like this should be in the EU or indeed in NATO, and those are political judgment calls. Those are not like this is not going to be sort of solved by lawyers for us. I think we need to have political leaders who will sort these things out. At the same time, political judgment calls are just different sort of categorical thing from sort of legal issues. Like we have legal issues with Poland. I don't want Poland to leave the EU by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Hungary is in a very different category thanks to 13 years of Viktor Orban's rule.
So not a very happy note to end on, but I want to thank you so much for the time is up. So thank you very much for this seminar, for the discussion, and for your presentations. So thank you so much to Nils Karlson, Dalibor Rohac, and Michelle Wohlgemuth, and to all of those who has listened to this webinar. So thank you so much. If you have the time, please stay and ask questions or continue the discussion. But if not, we'll see you another time. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.